Bonsoir à tous et à toutes. Merci beaucoup d'être venus ce soir pour cette nouvelle séance de l'état de l'art que je vais introduire en français, mais nous parlerons donc en anglais tout au long de cette discussion. Discussion que j'ai l'honneur de mener avec Marnie Sandwijs. Je parle trop fort. J'ai la voix un peu cassée, elle est plus forte que d'habitude. Voilà, comme ça c'est mieux, je vous casse pas les oreilles. Ok. Marnie Sandwijs est professeure émérite d'histoire à l'université de Princeton et autrice de nombreux ouvrages et spécialiste donc de l'histoire de la photographie, de l'Ouest américain, de la culture visuelle. Parmi toutes les publications que je ne citerai pas, sinon nous passerions la soirée, je voulais citer quand même Print the Legend, Photography and the American West, qui était paru en 2002 aux presses universitaires de Yale, ainsi que plus récemment Passing Strange, A Gilded Age Tale of Love and Deception Across the Color Line, aux éditions Penguin en 2009. Un autre projet sur lequel je voudrais revenir, parce que peut-être qu'il nous permettra aussi d'éclairer un peu ce soir question d'espace de l'histoire qu'on essaye de remplir, qui a marqué sa carrière à Princeton, c'est le Princeton Slavery Project, qui a eu lieu de 2013 à 2024, et qui a été une investigation donc, de plus d'une décennie sur l'implication de l'institution universitaire imbriquée avec l'institution esclavagiste et de l'héritage de ces deux derniers encore aujourd'hui sur le campus. C'est un site qui est accessible en open access, donc à tous, et que je vous conseille vivement, qui a été vraiment un projet avec des étudiants, des chercheurs, et Marnie qui a été la chef d'orchestre de tout cela. Mais aujourd'hui, ce qui nous rassemble, c'est l'ouvrage qui est sorti cet été aux presses universitaires de Princeton, qui est intitulé The Girl in the Middle, qui partant d'une seule photographie, d'une unique photographie, prise à la frontière de l'Ouest américain en 1868, de ce qui est à l'époque les États-Unis, tire les fils d'une histoire qui est plus complexe et entremêlée de tous ces protagonistes qui sont tous nommés sur cette photographie, sauf la jeune fille qui se trouve au centre. So now I'm going to switch to English for that talk. If it's too loud, just wave and I'll try to get a little further from the microphone. So thank you first, Marnie, for coming to us tonight on that dreary, rainy evening. Just to start on the discussion and to dive into that photograph with you, I'm not going to ask you when did you first see that photograph, but when did you first decided that it was the picture that you would focus for a full book? And maybe can you bring us with you into the picture and describe to us what we are seeing right now?
Merci. Can you hear me? Good. And I apologize that my schoolgirl French doesn't permit me to give a talk in French anymore. I understand that there's the same expression in French as there is in English. A picture is worth 1,000 words. Une image vaut mille mots, right? I've heard that expression all my life, but somehow I didn't pay attention because I just spent 140,000 words writing about this. So let me just tell you what you're looking at, and then we can talk about the challenges of writing about a picture like this. What you're looking at right here is an image I had made from an original negative. It's 33 by 46 centimeters in size, so about like that. And let me just ask you really, really quickly, what do you see? Just shout it out. Okay, six men and a little girl. White men, okay. Is the girl white? Okay, she doesn't look like she's white. She's wrapped in a blanket. Sorry?
Grass, just grass.
Yeah, yeah.
No architecture.
Yeah, and it's actually dead, dried up grass from last year, the previous year.
Very long way of having the people look
Yeah, it's a very odd, it's a very formal pose and a very odd pose. I want to suggest that I don't think you all are going to get to 1,000 words. It takes digging to figure this out. So that's what you initially see. What you're seeing in terms of looking at a material object is you're looking at an image made from a wet plate negative. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that process. It was very slow, it was very laborious. It was the dominant method for making photographs in the late 19th century. You would start with a sheet of window glass. You would take it into a dark tent. You would coat it with a thick, viscous mixture of something called collodion, which is gun cotton and ether mixed together. It's explosive. You would coat it, and then you would take that sticky negative and float it in a tray of light-sensitive silver nitrate solution. The light-sensitive layer would stick to the collodion, which would stick to the glass. You put it in a plate holder with a dark slide. You take the plate holder out to your view camera. You remove the dark slide. You remove the lens cap from your camera, expose the picture, and reverse course. And then you had to process the negative immediately. This is why it's called a wet plate negative. It was only sensitive to light while it was wet. So there's a sense of theater around the making of this picture. It probably took a skilled photographer he would have to complete it within half an hour, and he would have to use most of that time to do it, even though the exposure itself was about a second. Okay, that's what is a material object. But what are you looking at? So I have seen the paper prints made from this negative, and from that I know this. These 6 men have been sent west by the federal government of the United States to persuade, to demand that the Lakota and other native people of the Northern Plains sign treaties that will move them to newly created reservations. I know who these men are, and I know that the photographer is Alexander Gardner, who had distinguished himself just a few years before by photographing the American Civil War. And I know from looking at the prints of this picture, I know who these people are. On the far left is General Terry, who a few years later would find George Armstrong Custer and all of his men wiped out in the greatest native military battle victory in the United States. Next to him is the villain of my story, who I really need to talk about later, General Harney. He is a bad man. Next to him, does anybody any Americanists recognize the man standing just to the left of the girl? Some Americans would recognize him. He's General Sherman, who commanded the US troops in the Civil War. To the right of the child is General Sanborn. You would never have heard of him. To his right is an abolitionist and Indian rights activist named Samuel Tappan. And to the far right, the wonderfully named Christopher Columbus Auger, who had guarded President Lincoln's deathbed and decided who could come to tell him goodbye. But in all of the prints that I've seen, the girl is never named. Sometimes in handwriting it says Arapaho, which is one of the Northern Plains tribes. And here, as you can see in the lower right on the negative, it says Dakota. And for whatever reason, I decided I needed to figure out who she was.
Sorry, I'm surprised by my own voice. And so why did it matter to you to know who that girl was? And does it shifted the way you perceived that photograph before writing about everything that makes up the book? The name came first, right? Before the book.
Look, I don't advise anybody to write a book the way I wrote this book. I did not start with a big question. I did not start like, what was the cause of the Indian Wars? Why was there a civil war? I honestly started with a tiny question. Who is that girl? And some of you may know the expression of the French historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, who said there are two kinds of historians, parachutists and truffle hunters. So parachutists look up high, they discover big patterns across vast stretches of land, and truffle hunters dig around in the dirt. And I need to tell you, I'm afraid of heights. So I was down there in the rabbit holes all the time. So I think you can look at this picture and say, okay, if we don't know who she is, how can we talk about it? What would be the central thing that you notice? She's different, right? They're men, she's a girl. They're white, she appears to be native. They're older, she's young. So I think in some ways, if you don't know her name, you can look at this and see it as a metaphor for power relationships in the United States and really other places in 1868 when this picture was made. But as a historian, I don't like to deal with symbols and metaphors. I'm not happy thinking about her as a symbol or metaphor of anything. I really want to know who she is. And I think when we do know who she is, which we can talk about in just a minute, it changes everything about this picture.
And before we go back to who she is and the shift in perspective that it brings us to the book, I want to share a bit about experience of reading it and how I felt while reading the way. So we didn't put the summary of the book and the table of content, but the way you frame is a good word, but the way you divided the book in different chapters as many facets of the people who are making the picture by taking the picture or making the picture by being in it, felt like you were the photographer in this case, and you were changing the focus from one person to another, zooming in and out of their lives. And it was funny when you said that I'm not a parachuter, but by being a truffle hunter, the history that you are providing us maybe, and does, I think, also give us an overview of a vast array of land, because we're shifting from Washington to Fort Laramie throughout the book, but also taking deep gaze into a very time frame that goes way beyond the moment that that picture is taken. So I feel like you, by being like on the ground and truffle hunting all the information, you gave us a parachuter's view also of that history.
That's an interesting way to put it. I think one thing to acknowledge right off the bat is it's really hard to write about one photograph. Henri Cartier-Bresson, we all know, he called a photograph a decisive moment. I don't think there is anything decisive about this picture. And this picture is not history. It might be a historical source. It might launch me on a big historical investigation. But what is history? History is about things changing over time, whether by design or by accident or whatever. And nothing changes in this picture. You do not know what happened 2 minutes before, and you do not know what happens 2 minutes after. So to write about it, I had to realize that as a historian, I have a superpower. And my superpower is that I can figure out where these people came from, and I can figure out where they go. The photographer was there. The photographer was an eyewitness. He knew what these people smelled like. He knew what they had for breakfast. He knew what color their shirts really were, which of course is hard for us to see in a 19th century photograph. But he has no idea what happens to them next. So I think in a way the book explores a little bit the tension between a photographer who is an eyewitness and a historian like me who's coming at this later. And I do think photographers and historians do have some things in common. You have to figure out how to frame your story. You know, does the photographer aim his camera this way or this way? Just as a historian has to figure out, do you start on Thursday or do you start on Saturday? You have to choose who your characters are going to be. You have to decide who's going to be your the featured personality in your description of the world. But there's a profound difference in the perspective. And I guess you're right. Historians necessarily have more of a parachutist view, even if they're digging around in the dirt all the time.
It depends where you start. But at the end, I think that was the overview that you were giving us had kind of that distance, not in the distance that you put with the character and with their story, but in the sense that it made us see all it felt like a cobweb when I was reading it. It felt like and maybe that's where we're going to go back to Sophie, is that it felt that every person that is in that photograph at that moment is there at the moment that Garner is taking the picture, but they are all connected in other ways than that picture. And so that was your superpower in that, is that showing us that interconnectedness. We see the West, and I think at the time even more, people saw the West as that vast tract of land that was charted but also uncharted in some ways. And you show us that it's kind of like a small world where everyone knows or meets at one point each other, and even if they don't fully get and grasp who they're meeting, your superpower is like telling us that these encounters are important. And I feel like as other historians of the 19th century reading it, we are creating other relationships with our knowledge, and we are seeing names that we know of in other contexts also in your book. And so that web is expanding every time we're reading it, I think, also. Yeah.
Well, again, if anybody here is a student, this is not the way I encourage you to write your dissertation or your thesis or your book. I discovered it was a small world that connected these people, but I did not know that at the beginning. And can I talk about who the girl is?
Yeah, because I think she's the key. She's the key, yeah.
So, who the heck is the girl? And how do you figure that out? So I had a few hypotheses in the beginning. One was maybe she was a translator, a very young translator, because children on the northern plains at this time might have spoken any number of both European and native languages. But I found out who translated the treaty for these men, the negotiations, and there were no women. So then I thought maybe she's the daughter of one of the chiefs who's come into Fort Laramie, which is a fort along the overland trails where these men had gathered. And the chief wants to put his daughter into the picture to show that he's important and that he's there. But I couldn't find any record of that. So I read the letters of all of these men. I read all of the papers of this peace commission. I read all of the newspaper reporting talking about the treaty negotiations. Nothing. And then finally, at Fort Laramie, which is now a historic site run by the National Park Service, which is to say it's closed during the current federal shutdown in the United States, I found a little note card. And in 1978, a man named Eddie Ryan came through the fort and he saw a copy of this picture. And he said, I know who that girl is. It's my grandma. Her name is Sophie Musso. Now, Mr. Ryan was no longer alive for me to talk to, but I could quickly ascertain that he was 30 years old when his grandmother died, so it was plausible he could have recognized a photograph of her as a young girl. But Mr. Ryan is what we call an unreliable narrator. He claimed to be a direct descendant of Marie Antoinette, and I just don't think so. But anyway, I now had a name, and names are everything. Names are what connect people to the archives. Names are what connect people to families and to stories. And I quickly learned that Sophie's last name, Musso, was a common name on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation, which is now in South Dakota. It's one of the very poorest spots in the United States. So I placed an ad in the tribal newspaper, the Lakota Times, and said, I believe this girl to be Sophie Musso, and I would love to hear from her descendants. And I did. So I've been in touch with about 4 of her descendants. None of them have another photograph of her. So my work has been very important to them, and I have shared everything I find with them. If I go to the National Archives and find records, I send them copies. If I have a draft of a chapter about her, I send it to them. So I may have just uncovered Sophie's story, but I do not own it. I don't want anyone to ever think that. But let me talk just one more short story here, if that's okay. So, as I said, I'm a truffle hunter, and sometimes I get stuck underground way too long. And this is an example of it, but it's an example of what makes this kind of work powerful. Sophie, that little girl in the middle, in some ways exists because of the evil General Harney standing second from the left. Sophie is 8 years old in this picture, and I know she looks taller, but I think she's standing on a small box that you don't see. It's because if you look at it long enough, you see her legs look just much too long, right? And if you cut off her legs, her head is more proportioned to that of an 8-year-old girl. 13 years before this picture was made, General Harney and his men assaulted a peaceful Indian village along a river in western Nebraska at a place called Blue Water. They murdered 86 people. And they shot a young mother named Yellow Woman in the leg, and they took her baby and used it as target practice. Then they rounded up Yellow Woman and the other survivors and marched them 150 miles to Fort Laramie. In that assault, in that massacre, it wasn't a battle, it was a massacre, Harney and his men discovered that the Lakota, the native people there, had ammunition that had been given to them or sold to them by the French-Canadian traders who dominated the trade in this part of the United States. So Harney ordered all of the French-Canadian traders to come to Fort Laramie where he could keep an eye on them. So Yellow Woman with her injured leg comes into the fort. The French traders, including a man named M.A. Mousseau, come into the fort. Yellow Woman and M.A. Mousseau meet. They marry. They become Sophie's parents, and they're married for over half a century. So I don't say that to excuse the violence or to praise General Harney for being an accidental matchmaker, but I do want to suggest that sometimes terrible violence can have unexpected consequences, and very, very rarely those consequences can be good. So Sophie is here because of him.
Yeah. Thank you for all, and I think the book also goes into a lot more connections that are making us not understand that undecisive moment, but understand more about connections and encounters on a place that we know only through the names of the likes of Harney, or in the battles by the names of Sherman, and less by the names of the people who are on the sidelines of the history. And I think that's also one of the central focus of your book, to make us see differently all those connections between people that, even the people that are not in that picture, I think come through also your research, especially like the parents of Sophie, subsequent life also after, if we move to the after. But before we move to the afterlife of the photograph, I wanted to ask you and to maybe try and understand if the challenges that you faced during that history of the girl in the middle is something that is the same or different in different challenges that you also had in other history projects that you led throughout the last decades. And I think that the story that you did about Passing Strange is also trying to fill in those gaps of history through, as you said, treasure hunting, deep dive in archival research, but also merging in oral history passed down through generation, trying to, not saying that, as you say, that person think he's descendant of Marie Antoinette, so not saying like this is those persons are all reliable, but what they are saying have some truthness in it that I can corroborate or not with research, with other research on other people, and trying to understand more about their lives and how things worked more than one person. If that makes sense.
I mean, for me, the big takeaway from my work on this is that everybody's story matters. Little Sophie, whom you see here, proves to have an amazing life. She gets married when she's about 14 or 15 to an Irish-born white Civil War veteran. They have 5 children. The youngest is a nursing baby, and he falls in love with a white woman, and he banishes her to the Pine Ridge Reservation, and he kidnaps their children. She has no rights to get them back because she's a Native woman. She has no standing in a territorial court. It was before there was a state here, it was a territory. So I'm just going to sketch out just a few points of her life, because her life shows us there's connections here one would never imagine. She's banished to Pine Ridge. She gets a job in an Indian boarding school. And then she marries a man who, like her, has a Lakota mother and a white father. And he's been traveling around the country as a juggler in a Wild West show. But he's also a very experienced speaker of archaic forms of Lakota. And when anthropologists start coming to the reservation around 1900, he becomes the favorite translator. So I appreciate many of you don't know about this period of American history, but this is a moment when Indian people who have been roaming the northern plains and hunting bison and pursuing traditional life ways are losing their traditional culture, because they're shut into reservations, reserves, and cannot follow the hunt, cannot find food sources like before. They lose the old ways. But Sophie lives with a man who's interviewing the elders, and he's coming home every night. I just interviewed a woman who knows how to make teepees. I just interviewed a man who knows how to make arrows. So while other people were losing their culture, she oddly was gaining hers. With her second husband, she had 8 children, so that's 13 altogether. And she lives the last 50 years of her life on the Pine Ridge Reservation, one of the very poorest parts of the United States. What the heck is she doing here in this picture? Because that's one way of getting at your question, I think, Lucy, about connections. Well, what do her parents think when they see General Harney? Do they explain to her why her mother limps? Because that man shot her in the leg? Do they explain to her she had a little sibling, half-sibling she never met? Her father had once worked for General Harney. They're at Fort Laramie now because their ranch has just been raided. All of their horses have been stolen. Their house was burned down. They've come to the fort for safety. He sees Harney, and maybe he needs work. So he puts his daughter in the picture to curry his favor. 2 weeks before this picture is made, her father hires the man standing just to the right of Sophie, who's a lawyer, to press their case to get money, reparations from the federal government for the Indian raids. So maybe the lawyer wants to prove his clients are there. Maybe Gardner wants her there, because imagine how boring this picture would look without her, right? She's adding something to the picture. But I really love to imagine that she's there because she wants to be. You can't see it in this picture, but there are probably 10,000 Indian people in camps around the fort right now. There's horses, there's dogs, there's cook fires. There is so much noise, there's smells, there's smoke. You can't see any of that in the picture. She has 4 younger siblings, and she probably has to keep them safe all the time. And for one special afternoon, she gets to do something none of her brothers and sisters ever got to do, and she gets to pose for this photograph. But you know, it's a weird thing to work about on a photographer like Gardner. He took hundreds or thousands of pictures. So there are so many days we know exactly where he was, on that battlefield, at this fort, in that studio. And yet he left almost no writing. So we can document where he was, but we cannot document what he thought. And I'm unwilling to second guess it.
And it's the same thing with Gardner. What you are doing with that research is also shifting the focus again from the Gardner that most of Americanists know. I won't go up to French, I'm not sure. But most 19th century Americanists know of, which is Civil War Gardner and Harvest of Death. And you're going before the Gardner of the Civil War and doing the historian's job of questioning all the sources and which has been written about Gardner and picturing a new Gardner that we didn't know of, or people made assumption about his past life, and you went into that correcting history and showing his journey from Scotland up to the United States. But you're also showing the Gardner after the Civil War with that picture that we don't know a lot of. We know of pictures of Native Americans in reservations. We don't always know that they were made by Gardner or by someone else. And you also diving into that history of making photographs on the frontier and trying to understand how Fort Laramie was a place where taking pictures of Native Americans also shifted the way they perceived the technology. And so that picture was also something that was possible because photographers came before Gardner and took pictures.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, I would just say one thing about Gardner. He is, as Lucy suggests, a very well-known figure in the history of American photography. But when you start reading the sources, everybody's going back to the same sources. And then go to their sources, and they don't always exist. So again, to all of you who are students now too, I would just say this: there is so much online now. Nobody ever went to look at the Scottish vital records before. I went to look at them. They're online. You can find them. There are newspapers you can read now that scholars 20, 30, 40 years ago couldn't access. So don't be afraid to write about someone about whom other people have written, because you can go find new things. You really, really can. And that was certainly my experience writing about Gardner.
Yeah. So before we leave the floor for questions, one of the last questions I had, and one I think is one of the threads of the book, beyond the facts, beyond all the connections that we learn about and all the history that we learn about, is that I think that book is also, and maybe you research in general beyond the girl in the middle, he's showing us how people assumed for centuries that taking a picture and passing it out to people without documenting the names was also maybe them thinking that knowledge would pass on differently, and showing us how hard it is to work as historians to reconstruct history when people make assumption that, you know, the name of that person in the middle, or that girl in the middle, the name of Sophie, the people in the picture mightn't know her name when the picture was taken, and that picture that was taken by Gardner was mostly given as a memento to the people in the picture, to the male in the picture. And reconstructing the history and the work of a historian to understand it and to shed a new light on an image and to battle that assumption that knowledge will stay on forever, and how we can reconstruct that. How do you think about it as also a historian today, and not only a historian of that picture? And how do you think about that assumption of we have to keep knowledge and maybe to the next generations?
Well, you know, as I mentioned, I've met a number of Sophie's great and great-great-grandchildren. And in a way, when I first met them, they thought, we know about her. They have fading stories. Sophie died in 1936. So there's nobody alive now who knew her. But I think the family has learned from my conversations with them and from reading my work that knowledge isn't just something that's in your blood. It's not just something you know. It's something that you get through a lot of hard work. And I really appreciate their support of my work. You know, they have had no other they've never had a photograph of their great-grandmother. Now they have a photograph of her. And they have a photograph to go with their stories, and they have my stories to go with their stories. I mean, I would say to all of you when you walk out of here, go home, pull that shoebox out of your closet, and label your family photographs. Because everybody's story matters in ways you may or may not be able to see right now. And I lucked out with Sophie. We can know much more about her, despite the fact that she's a native child growing up in remote places, than we can about most people born on the northern plains in the United States in 1860. Her father lived a very long time. As I mentioned, he was French-Canadian. His brother actually became Premier of Quebec. You know, who would imagine that? But he lived a long time, and he was the kind of man people would come to and say, tell us about the old days. So those stories survive. Her father pressed legal cases against the federal government. Those records survive. Her first husband, good thing she got rid of him, marched into a hotel restaurant and murdered his second wife and stepdaughter over Sunday lunch. So court records kept track of him. And then once she's compelled to live on a reservation, the federal government is keeping track of her because they keep track of who gets food rations and who later will get land. So it's not knowledge it's not knowledge that was ever all put together before to form a biography of a person, but it's knowledge that was out there and not very readily accessible to most people.
Yeah, and what I really like about the research, and we say, and I think it ties back to the beginning of our discussion, is that even if that girl is not Sophie Mousseau, we know a lot more about Sophie Mousseau and the name. When we found that name written on a card, it was the moment where the biography of that person that only her descendant knew about, only her descendant knew her name and her first name and her last name, then you were able to tie all the knots together.
Yes,
and
you need a name. You need a name when you go into the archive. Absolutely, yeah.
And so maybe my question was trying to get you to talk a bit about the afterlife of that project and to the role of the historian. So once that you have done all that research, now that you published the book, you said that he had also not only an impact, I think, for researchers and historians, but also for the family of Sophie Mousseau. But what happened to the document?
There's more. I did not see this coming. I thought I was writing about the past. And right after my book came out, a descendant of the evil General Harney, and I have not explained all his evilness. He also murdered a young enslaved mother in his house, and he got away with murder. A descendant of his reached out to me through email, and I thought, uh-oh, he's going to be really angry about all the bad things I said about General Harney. But no, he was happy that I found even more bad things than he already knew about. Because it turns out that for 20 years, he has been engaged in a voyage, a project of reparation for what his ancestor did. And he has been working with a Lakota family, the Little Thunder family, and it was their family that ran the camp that Harney massacred in 1855. So it's all coming back, you know, to finding the girl, finding that her mother was at the massacre, seeing Harney here. The stars aligned. I was in Washington, D.C. to give a book talk in May. The Harney descendant told me he was there. I said, can I meet you for coffee? I would love to meet you. And he said, no, give me your ID information. I'm getting you a security clearance, and you are coming with me and the Little Thunders to the Smithsonian Institution storage facility tomorrow. We're looking at the artifacts collected on the massacre field at Blue Water. So for 20 years, these people had worked together to make the Smithsonian bring these things out of storage and show them. what had been collected on the massacre field in 1855, and I learned about it the night before. And I was there with them at the museum, 2 members of the Little Thunder family, a tribal cultural affairs officer, and the Harney descendant, when they pulled these things out of storage. There was weeping, there was drumming, there was smudging, people were burning sage, which makes museum curators nervous. And then there was singing. And the families wanted the Smithsonian to return all of the artifacts by September 5th, I think, of this year to the family for the 170th anniversary of the massacre. And I just thought, they're not following the news. And I don't know if you're following the news, but the Trump administration is attacking how history is preserved and taught and exhibited in the Smithsonian. At this moment, the Smithsonian was not going to give things back to a family, but they did. And I was on the massacre field in Blue Water about 7 weeks ago when the artifacts were returned to the Lakota tribe. So I never imagined falling into a story like this. I never imagined my book would be relevant. The owner of the massacre field bought 20 copies of the book to give to people. But it shows that history matters. It matters to little Sophie's relatives and her descendants who have come to my book talks. It matters to Lakota people. It matters to how we think about history in the United States. When you put forgotten people back in the stories, you find forgotten stories. And you were able to paint a much richer picture of what was happening during this period of American life.
I would like to thank Marnie again for writing the book, for coming to us tonight, for the discussion, and thank you all also for your questions.
Thank you, Lucy.
And before we leave, that's the announce time. Je vais repartir en français, je crois. Le livre de Marnie est disponible à Paris, à la librairie Smith & Sons, rue de Rivoli. Il y a plusieurs copies. Il y en a une de moins à cause de moi, mais il y en a encore beaucoup. Et la semaine prochaine, nous nous retrouvons pour le dernier jeudi du mois, donc les débats de l'INHA. Et nous parlerons encore des États-Unis, mais de choses un peu moins, tout aussi peu réjouissantes, et de l'actualité de ce qui se passe aujourd'hui aux États-Unis, des expositions en lien avec les expositions à Paris aussi, qui ont lieu beaucoup en ce moment sur le minimalisme, l'art américain avec un prisme français, et en lien avec l'actualité bien sûr. Et nous entendrons donc Elvan Zabunian et Hélène Valence en discussion avec Claire Moulin du journal Libération. Donc vous êtes tous et toutes les bienvenus à 18h30, ici même la semaine prochaine, si cela vous intéresse, je l'espère. Voilà. Thank you, Marnie. Thank you for everything, and good evening to all.